Good evening. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. These are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders, past and present, and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to the third in the five-part series, Radical Self-Acceptance as Activism, curated by Olaya Land and presented in partnership with Third Place Books. We're grateful to our author series sponsor, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, and the Seattle Times for generous support of library programs. Thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. I wanted to let folks know that we have closed captioning for this event. You can access the closed captioning by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I also wanted to let you know that after Olaya and Amanda are done chatting, we'll have time for questions from you. You can ask your questions at any time during the program by writing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after the program, we'll be interested in hearing from you. We'll post a link to a program survey in the chat, and I'd appreciate it if you took a minute after the event to fill it out. We'd love to hear what you think. Now, I am delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Olaya Land is the founder and editor of Lioness, an online journal and community promoting connection, confidence, sisterhood, and self-love. She's the host of the Lioness podcast as well. Olaya also leads retreats and workshops all over the world that help people feel empowered and connect to their creativity. I've been a big fan of Olaya's work for years and was thrilled when she agreed to be a guest curator for us, and have just really been enjoying the series. It's a great lineup. I'll post a link to the full lineup in the chat in a little bit. Tonight, we're super excited that Olaya is going to speak with Amanda Machado. Amanda's a writer and facilitator whose work explores how race, gender, power, and identity affect the way we travel and experience the outdoors. After teaching ninth grade English as a Teach for America Corps member, she spent 15 months backpacking South America, South Asia, Western Europe, and the Western United States. And since then, she's written and facilitated on topics of social justice and adventure, and lived in cities like Cape Town, Havana, Mexico City, Berlin, and Rio de Janeiro. Amanda has been published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, Harper's Bazaar, NBC News, Outside, and Business Insider, among others. And she's also worked as a social justice editor for Matador Network, the world's largest independent travel magazine. Her work has also been featured in the New York Times, NPR, National Geographic, Travel and Leisure, Jezebel, and several other publications, radio programs, and blogs. In addition to her essay writing, Amanda also facilitates workshops on justice and anti-oppression for organizations around the world, including REI, Patagonia, Campgrounds of America, which you may know as COA, K-O-A, and University of California, Berkeley, among many others. So please help me welcome Olaya Land, and then in a minute, Amanda Machado. Hi,
Hello.
Olaya.
Hi, thanks for having me. Welcome everyone to this evening's talk. Before we get started, I just like to talk a little bit about the concept behind these talks. So first of all, I was so thrilled when the Seattle Public Library reached out to me and asked me if I would be a guest curator, because I love our library system. It has been a lifesaver during the pandemic. I've always loved our library, so it's such an honor to be curating this series. And I wanted to speak just a little bit about the concept for this series. When I was told that I had carte blanche to design a talk series around anything that I wanted, I came up with this idea of radical self-acceptance as activism for several reasons. First of all, the last year and a half have really shifted things for a lot of us. The pandemic has highlighted this sense that life is fleeting and unpredictable and precious. 2020 also exposed us to some of the deep schisms, racial schisms in this country. We were exposed to a lot of violence on communities of color, and it also exposed the need that we have to work towards justice and equity in a sustainable way. And then also, more recently, I've just been witnessing acute burnout around me everywhere. So that was kind of in combination with reading the works of Adrienne Maree Brown particularly pleasure activism, and also Tricia Hersey at the NAP Ministry, exposed me to the concept that rest and self-care and self-love and self-acceptance could be acts of activism in and of themselves, which was just like a radical concept for me that I fell in love with. And I wanted to expose that, share it with more people, lean into it, investigate it. So the purpose of this talk series, the goal of this talk series, is really to explore what radical acceptance can look like in its many forms, and also how we can use radical self-acceptance and meaningful self-care as a way to care for ourselves, our families, our friends, our communities, to offset some of the trauma and the burnout and the stress of the past year and a half. So that's the concept behind the series. I'm so excited to speak with Amanda Machado this evening. So Amanda, if you're ready to turn your camera on, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm also a huge fan of libraries. It's not an exaggeration to say it. They saved my life when I was a kid and a high school student. They're the reason all of this stuff happened later on. So it's really, really great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Before we get started, I just want to say that like your writing on making outdoors, exploring and travel more accessible it's really fantastic. Like in going through all of your work to put together some questions for this talk, just the breadth and depth of your thought on this topic is really fascinating. So I hope people after this talk, we're going to post some links, and I highly, highly urge everyone to go out and read your work because it's really important. It's really fantastic. So welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, and I wanted to say, especially for Seattle, I'm sure we have a lot of perhaps mostly Seattleites on the call. And, you know, we are an outdoorsy bunch up here in Seattle. So I really think that tonight's talk is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Okay. So before we get started, I always the first question I like to ask everyone is to talk a little bit about your story, because when I see people doing cool shit in the world, people like bringing a new message, people like writing interesting things, I always want to know, like, how did you get here? What is your path? So if you could speak a little bit just about your history with outdoor exploring and travel and how you came to do the work that you are doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like maybe many kids when I was young, I would just always say that I wanted to travel the world. That was one of those things I remember in kindergarten, whenever they asked you, what are your dreams in life? I was always travel the world, but I didn't actually know what that meant. And I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know anyone who had ever done that before. And a lot of that changed when I decided to study abroad in South Africa during college and would go to these hostels and meet all these women, mostly from Australia. I remember one woman specifically from Norway who was just by herself with a backpack in this hostel, did have no one with her. And she had just been roaming around in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, traveling just with what she had on her back and on very little money, right? And so like seeing her, talking to her, I remember just thinking, this is actually something I can do, right? This is something that's actually accessible to me. I just need to prioritize this as a part of my life. So after I graduated from college, I got a job as a teacher. I worked doing Teach for America for 2 years. And in those 2 years, I just felt like I had done all the right things, right? I had an Ivy League degree. I had a job with health insurance and a 401k. Like my immigrant parents were really happy with the decision. I had a boyfriend, long-term stability, great. Everything seemed great on paper, but the reality was I was incredibly burnt out by the work I was doing. There was a lot of things that still didn't feel fulfilled. And I still had this dream that I really wanted to do, right? And still felt like something would be missing if I didn't do it. So I felt like after finishing my commitment with Teach for America, that was the right time to do what I knew now a lot of people in Europe and Australia call a gap year, right? Which Americans don't really do very often, but take a year off just to explore themselves, learn, travel, discover new parts of themselves. And so then that's what I did. I packed up all my belongings, sold a lot of furniture, quit my job, ended my relationship, packed 30 liters into a backpack, and that's all I carried for the next 15 months. I ended up going for 15 months, longer than a gap year, I suppose, a gap year and a half, a little bit.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So then after that, I mean, I think once I was out there, there was so much happening for me, just so much inspiration that came from that trip. And I think during that trip, I read this essay by Audre Lorde, which has this quote that I go back to every year, where she says that for once we begin to feel deeply all aspects of our lives, we begin to demand of our lives and our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with the joy that we now know we're capable of. And so that's what travel for me felt like, right? Now I had felt this joy, this relaxation, this part of me that like never was accessible when I was working so much or in demanding schools and universities and just kind of in the hustle grind culture of the US. And now that I'd felt that, there was no way I could go back, right? There was no way I could go back to weekend warrioring or just getting fulfillment off, weekend partying and then hustling throughout the week and doing work that burns you out. And all of that just didn't seem possible anymore, right? Now that I knew I was capable of something else, I started to demand that from other parts of my life. And so that's where I decided, to start my work as a writer, as a facilitator, and start focusing all my work on how I can find ways to get women of color to have access to these experiences, and women that don't have the privilege I did of studying abroad and meeting other people who did it first, that they could also know that they could do it too.
I love that. And we have a request in the chat, actually, if somebody asked if you could read the quote again.
Yes, I have it right here. Let's see. By Audre Lorde, for once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy, which we now know ourselves to be capable of.
That is powerful. I love that. I'm going to have to look that up after the chat. So good. And that actually is a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next, which is I wanted to kind of break this into two parts and talk first a little bit about nature exploring, and then in a second part about travel, about justice-oriented travel, as you call it. So, but I would like to talk first about that healing power of nature, that power of getting out of our everyday lives and exploring. And when I was preparing for this talk, the word that kept coming to mind is biophilia. And I remember when I heard that term for the first time, 5 years ago or 6 years ago or something, the idea that humans possess an innate tendency to seek out nature and other living beings. And I thought, oh my gosh, yes, that I think a lot of people understand that inherently. I personally use nature for being in nature for clearing my mind, settling my spirit, just feeling more in touch with myself. And as you mentioned, out of the hustle and grind culture, I think it's so powerful for that. And you've written about the healing power of nature, particularly about how nature creates a feeling of awe. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways you find time in nature to be restorative for you personally, or ways that you've seen other people, especially people from marginalized communities, using nature as soul medicine.
Yeah. So the part about awe, there was a study done a few years ago by a person named Craig Anderson, and basically he took teens from the Bay Area here that were diagnosed with PTSD for one reason or another. And then he also took veterans that were also diagnosed with PTSD, and then he took them river rafting in Utah and Colorado and lots of different places. And they saw the results before and after that river rafting trip. And what they found was that out of all the positive emotions that people experienced on that trip, the one that caused the most positive change in PTSD symptoms was awe. So it was this idea of nature providing that inspiration and that moment of awe that really decreased by 30%, stress-related symptoms after they came back. So in some ways, Craig Anderson would argue afterwards that doctors need to prescribe nature instead of prescribing medications, because it's in some ways more effective than other tools of medicine or forms of medicine. Sorry?
And free, can be that.
Yeah. In some ways. Well, rafting trips, not necessarily.
That's true.
Accessible in our backyards and in public parks, for sure, right? There's ways we can get small doses of it. Absolutely. And so that made me think, before I did my travels, I was teaching here in Oakland with a lot of students that were diagnosed with PTSD, and came from really violent and traumatized backgrounds. And it made me think about how in my work as a teacher, we always talked about the achievement gap and how students of color were not achieving at levels of white privileged kids. But we also never talked about an awe gap, right? I was also noticing that white privileged kids also have access to moments that give them awe, right? To these river rafting trips, to camping, to camp, overnight camps that all my friends would go to, where they get to be in nature all the time and get to have those experiences. But for a lot of my students, I don't know if they could name the last time they really felt awe, in any moment of their lives. And that wasn't something that was super accessible to them. And that was an emotion I felt all the time during the year I took off traveling, right? And I noticed how healing that was, right? And how much that could make a difference in, again, the Audrey quote, what you demand from your life, right? Now that you know you're capable of that feeling, you start to shift everything else around getting that feeling on a more daily basis, right? So that's something that became just really pivotal in the kind of work that I do, is just thinking about, how can we get students from those backgrounds to start accessing those transformational experiences on a more day-to-day basis.
Yes, I love that. And calling out this awe gap that we need to close for students in marginalized communities. And I loved one thing that you wrote about in that study from Craig Anderson was the idea, I think it was part of that study, was the idea that even like micro doses of nature have an effect, have like a measurable effect, which for me, like, I think I felt that like just intuitively, but it's so just a good call out, a good reminder that even like, instead of scrolling social media on your lunch break, like just go take a turn around your neighborhood, or like take your coffee outside in the backyard and just listen to the birds. Like even these tiny moments of like awe or connection with nature are also powerful, or can help you regulate your nervous system. Or that for me was very like reassuring.
Yeah, I think the pandemic made us realize that too, right? That even just like a walk around the block made a huge difference when we were stuck inside all day. And something I try to do with my work too is just make people realize that, yeah, like rafting trips are a way to access awe, but we also don't have to commercialize nature in that way, right? We don't have to make it something we have to consume. It is available. It is literally the freest thing we have. It's everywhere. And if we can, yeah, like tap into that on a more daily basis, I think that also makes a difference.
Yes, I love that message. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about being a person of color in the outdoors, which is a large part of what you write about. You wrote one piece, I don't remember what publication it was on, but you wrote about a hiking trip you took for the first time at age 19 as part of a college program. And that really resonated with me because I had the exact same experience. Or like before my freshman year of college, there was a thing that my college was putting together, like come out, they owned this forest property in Connecticut, like come hike on the campus forest. And I was like, okay, this will be great. And like, I had never done any kind of backcountry camping, hiking. And you wrote about like not even knowing like what kind of like hiking shoes to get. And all of that just resonated with me so deeply because I had the exact same experience. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yeah, I had never heard of backpacking or hiking growing up. My dad is from the Andes, but had never hiked in the Andes before. My mom's from Mexico City, which is also at elevation, but never was much of a hiker either. So when I got this scholarship to do this program, I remember we went to the Army surplus store to get all of my gear because we didn't know what gear was. We didn't know what water resistance, Gore-Tex, all these terms just didn't make any sense to us. I had no idea what REI was. So yeah, we went to like thrift stores and Army surplus stores to get wool socks and like jackets and the shoes and everything else I needed for that trip. And when I was on that trip, I was one of few people of color that was actually on that trip as well. And so I think even after that, and studying abroad in Cape Town, these are all like my first experiences with hiking, but I was always the only person of color there. And it always felt like I had to kind of choose whether I want to indulge this hobby of mine or be with my community. And I think when I took that year off to travel, what changed was that I started hiking in Latin America. And so for the first time, I actually started seeing people who look like me and have my same culture, rock climbing and kayaking and fishing and scaling mountains and summiting volcanoes and things like that. And that really just changed that was the representation I needed, right? To finally believe that of course this isn't a white people thing. Of course this is, a scam actually, that we've marketed hiking as a white people thing when people of color, Indigenous people, Black folks have been doing this for hundreds of years, right? Whether out of necessity or out of just a deep connection to nature, right? That was just a part of our life, right? And integrated into everything else.
Yeah, there was, just to interrupt you for one second, there was one piece that you wrote about how you were hiking, I think maybe in the Andes or somewhere in Latin America. And like you had a guide who had like 3 times the weight of your pack or something and was doing this trek completely just like in sandals.
Absolutely.
Because that was the way it was done for those cultures in that area. And so, but we think we've got to have like our Arc'teryx jacket and our super like Gore-Tex. And that was so revelatory, this idea of like, oh, it doesn't actually have to be like that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Peru, right? Yeah, everyone hiked in sandals. We were the only ones with hiking boots. It was mostly women that were carrying these huge packs tied around at the front. The men, the porters, yeah, it would carry 3 times the weight that the hikers, the tourists were carrying. And even the Machu Picchu trail, I always tell people that when I talk to the porters on that trip, I did the Machu Picchu Trail like every tourist in 4 days. It was difficult and arduous. And the porters were like, we actually do the whole thing in one day when y'all aren't around. Like we just run it, we try to see who can go the fastest. Sometimes we do it barefoot. That's the big secret, right? Like for the tourists, it's like this huge journey, but for the people there, it's really common, right? And the Incan culture, they had a name for people. They called them chasquis, and chasquis were the runners, and that was their job. Their job was actually to run from Cusco to Lima, delivering messages for the politicians and the people, in control of the government there. So yeah, this is like so much in Latin American blood, right? To be in the mountains, to be running, to be hiking. The idea that it's something that only white people are good at then becomes kind of ridiculous, right? When you start to see it that way. And of course, now I'm always for safety. I think there's a reason we have gear to keep folks safe. And I also think that the way we've hyped it up kind of creates this inaccessibility, right?
Yeah, and a dichotomy too between like this is like the like Western or American way, like this is the right way to do it. I think there's a lot of that sense as well. Like you got to be like completely geared up, and or just a lack of maybe respect for the ancestral ways of engaging with nature like that.
Right. I mean, even I have a coworker the other day that she doesn't really hike very much. And I was like, Carol, like we should go on a hike. Like we can just go this really flat trail through the park near here, Oakland. And she's like, no, I'm not much of a hiker. And I just told her like, hiking is just walking for white people. Like that's really all it is. And her mind just was like, you know what, you're right. You're right. I love walking. So I must love hiking. I'm going to go. And so we're going to go next week. We're going to plan this. And like really, like when people really think about it, it's like this is really what's happening, right? Like we're compartmentalizing it, we're commercializing it, we're making it into something that feels so inaccessible when really it's just we're walking around trees.
Well, I'm glad you called that out, because when you said it was like a flat trail, I was like, does that count as hiking? Like, does flat trails count? Because for me, like living in Seattle, like all you see, what you see is like, if you're not like hanging from like a sheer face with like your pick, you're not hiking, you're not doing it right. So I love that it's just like just walking in nature.
Yeah. I mean, I think, varying levels, right? Like obviously certain trails, that's not the case. You need good shoes. But there's a lot of times that I think people kind of sell themselves short thinking that this is a lot more fancy, than it actually needs to be.
Totally. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to the outdoors specifically as a queer person of color. So how is it different from that of like somebody who's hetero or white people? How has it evolved? And yeah, actually I'll ask you that. And then I have a little quote I want to read from your work.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like queerness for me, I came out later in my 20s, like pretty late blooming queer. So I kind of feel like that Audrey quote is also the way I relate to my queerness, right? And like after discovering a different level of being authentic to myself, a different level of joy, then it was impossible to go back to believing in heteronormativity in general and in being a straight person or identifying that way. And I think traveling helped me do that. A lot of my first experiences were while living abroad. Maybe there was something about the foreign language, foreign place that made it easier to just try something different and try like a foreign thing, what at that time felt like a very foreign thing to be or to accept about myself. I also think in hiking culture, I was allowed to show aspects of my gender that I never felt actually able to do as a Latina woman in the United States, right? Where I think the value is more on being very presentable, being very fragile, being very delicate. The Eva Longoria, Sofia Vergara stereotype is what I thought of as what Latinx femininity needed to look.
Wait a second. You're not hiking in high heels and 6
No.
Yeah, totally.
I'm never wearing heels. That never happened. But I think before this, there was a lot of shame in that, like, why can't I be like them? Why can't I fit into that? And I think through hiking, it was my first time allowing myself to accept that part of myself, right? I would have to go 8 days without shaving my legs because you're out on the trail. You're not going to bring a razor while hiking and camping, right? You're going to let your hair do whatever it wants. You're going to wear whatever's most comfortable. So I think that was a way of gaining some kind of acceptance of how I wanted to express myself in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality. I think a lot of that was helped by like the unconditional love of the outdoors, right? The outdoors, nature, they don't care who you are. They don't care who you are in love with. They don't care what you look like, right? The trees are just going to be there. So I think in that way, it really, I don't think I maybe noticed at the time, but I think now looking back, I think it was a huge part of that journey for me.
I love that like positive like impact, the way it like allowed you to like expand and like I just think there's something, whether it's just in nature or being on the other side of the world, of being out of our normal grooves and our ways that we think we have to show up in the world, I think is super powerful. This actually leads well into another question I wanted to ask you, which you write a lot about some of the reasons people of color don't participate in outdoor adventure / recreation to the extent that white people do. And I hadn't really thought through them before. Like I've thought about lack of exposure, but you write about financial barriers. For me, it was interesting that 40% of people who participate in outdoor recreation have incomes over $75,000 a year. That was really revelatory. Also feeling unsafe. You write about how some of the most like pristine or sought after or most considered most beautiful spaces have histories of racial violence. Like to me, it was really interesting. You write that Montana and Idaho are like #1 and #2 in terms of the number of hate groups there. Like I personally, like I'm not going to Montana. I mean, that's how I feel about it right now. Like, and when you wrote that, I really felt that. Like when I hear about people of color going to Montana, I'm like, oh, like really? So like also just, but things that I hadn't thought about before were like these cultural barriers of you talk about like people with immigrant parents or growing up in certain cultures, like not wanting to camp because it gives the impression that that's all you can afford, that maybe that you can't afford a hotel, or unfamiliar foods, like camping food, stuff like that. And then what I thought of was just even something as simple, you were talking about your hair, like in camping, just as simple as your hair. Like if you have like ethnic hair, specifically like Black girl hair, like that's like hard to take care of out, like can be like out on the trail. So like you have to, there's all these things to think through. So anyway, that was really like interesting to me to think through all of that. Yeah, are there any others that like come to mind in terms of like barriers that keep people of color from enjoying the outdoors to the extent that white people do?
I mean, I think you listed a lot of great stuff. I think every time I do workshops on diversity, equity, inclusion, and I talk about how people of color don't feel safe, my reaction very often from white folks is they feel like I'm exaggerating. There's kind of
no.
right? And so I do think the first step is just to really, really internalize and acknowledge how deep this goes in our history. The examples you mentioned, Oregon wrote into the Constitution that it was going to be a white supremacist state. So I think a lot of times, when white folks are like, oh, I'm not sure why, whenever I go hiking in Oregon, there's only white people. That was intentional, right? That was incredibly intentional. Pools, parks, beaches were all segregated until the Civil Rights Act. A lot of pools, beaches, and parks closed once they were forced to allow Black folks and people of color in. Closed for decades. Some of them didn't open again until the 80s or 90s because they just refused to follow the Civil Rights Act, right? Before the Civil Rights Act, in segregated pools, if a Black person came in, police often allowed people to literally beat Black folks out of the water, right? So that was totally acceptable. There's lots of documentation of this happening in California here. So I think, again, when I'm doing workshops and white folks ask, oh, like we have like surfing and Black folks don't like to sign up for surfing or they don't like to swim. There's just a complete lack of acknowledgement of how intentionally policies created that kind of culture now, right? Like that's not an accident and it's not cultural, it's systemic and it's institutionalized, right? So I think it's just really important to really, really double down on that, right? We saw last summer with Ahmaud Arbery, just going for a run, you can get killed. People of color have known this for years. We feel this a lot. I don't fault you for not wanting to go to Montana, even though Montana is beautiful. I can totally understand that it's a legitimate boundary that some folks can have to not go there, right? And to not want to risk it, right? And that's something that I sit with between that and the cultural stuff, right? That also comes from trauma, as you mentioned. No one allowing folks to have these different options when they hike, right? There's ways you can hike and take care of your hair. There's ways you can camp and not and still access your culture, right? I think about the first backpacking trip I went on and we had a spice rack. There was no hot sauce. There was like salt and pepper in the spice rack. We don't have to do that, right? Now that I've like backpacked with Latino people, you can carry hot sauce. You can cook carne asada when you're camping, like you can integrate those things. But I think without folks showing you how to do that and letting you know that that's okay, and that that's just as legitimate as the way, as trail mix or as anything else that you might have seen or associated with outdoor culture, I think it can be really hard. It's super hard to trust that then, to trust that this is something that's actually for you.
Yeah, and I wanted to call out specifically for Seattle, for my hometown. You talk about these kind of barriers to people of color accessing the outdoors, but you also talk about like more subtle forms of like lack of representation. And I think in more progressive areas, like Seattle is very progressive, but there was one example you talked about a woman of color who, when she went hiking with her husband, she was a person of color, I believe her husband was white, and people would stop on the trail, they wouldn't even speak to her. Her husband was the authority. And that is like an overlap of gender and race. But also, or you talked about a brochure that all the people in the brochure were white until it got to the scholarship section, and then they were people of color. And I just want to call that out because I think that's like people in Seattle, I often are like, oh, well, we're not Montana, we're not Idaho, we don't have the Ku Klux Klan here, even though we probably do, like in Eastern Washington. But anyway, but those, even in those more subtle areas, we need for people to show up differently and do different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I struggle with representation, particularly right now in the outdoors, is that like I do think we need to see ourselves in the REI catalog, and we do need to see ourselves, summiting mountains and doing all these things to feel like we're capable of it as well. And part of me is also like, do we really want to have a seat at a table that is rooted in a lot of racist, colonialist, capitalist ideas of what the outdoors can look like, right? Like this idea that we have to just conquer the outdoors by summiting things and climbing to the top of the mountain and doing the most risky stuff and getting to the top of Everest or climbing the mountain no one else has climbed before, right? Is a really colonialist idea, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a struggle I've had very recently. I think when I started out in this work, I really wanted to see people of color doing that stuff to show like we can do it too, right? And I think now I'm wondering, like, do we ask for a seat at the table, or do we build our own table and ask white folks to come here, right? Because a lot of us are already sitting at that table. We already know from our ancestors, from our grandparents who made herbal medicine or who taught us things about trees, that we have a connection to nature, right? We've been outside in different ways. It just hasn't been legitimized by the mainstream outdoor travel industry, which only sees the outdoors in that, specific consumeristic capitalist colonialist way, right? So that's something I sit with now too, like I want folks to feel like they can do whatever they want that brings them joy. And I want them to feel affirmed if they never summit a mountain, but are still an outdoorsy person because of the specific way they and their family and their culture has told them to relate to the outdoors.
That is so good. Like somebody wrote in the chat, like so powerful. And it really is. And that one's really resonating with me because I just feel in Seattle, like the outdoors culture is very extreme. Like it is a very like conquering, scaling Mount Rainier, and I just want to go for a hike around some trees. Like, yeah, like I just want to be out like communing with nature. So like I love that reminder. And I just want to remind people that if you have questions or things that if this is bringing up questions for you or things you would like to discuss, please drop them into the Q&A. At the bottom, there's a little Q&A panel, and I will come back to those at the end of our chat. Okay, this leads me to kind of a final thing I want to talk about as we're talking about the outdoors here, which is basically one of the main points I wanted to cover in this chat is how folks from marginalized communities can take up space and engage in the healing power of nature while feeling safe, and how non-marginalized people can help make that happen. So could you talk a little bit about ways, like tangible ways, that I know you just talked about this dichotomy between like, well, should we like be empowering people to go take part in the system that already exists, or should we be encouraging people to like build their own table? But yeah, do you have any thoughts on tangible ways that both people from marginalized communities and white people, cis het people, whatever that may be, can work to make outdoor spaces more inclusive?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that I've been sitting with a lot, that I think I, as a person of color, was at fault of doing as well, was kind of buying into like the individualistic way of thinking about travel and outdoor culture. Like when I told you the story from the beginning, it was all about my journey to self-discovery, right? And like my path. It was very eat, pray, love, right? Like and discover ourselves in these foreign lands. And, Saneep Roy is a writer who says that the travel industry is all about white people discovering themselves in brown places. And I think that hit me because I think as a brown person, I think I fell into the same trap. I still was trying to use these foreign places as kind of the backdrop for my self-discovery. And in a lot of ways, that's also like buying into a colonialist tradition, right? Of seeing other people's homes as not other people's homes and seeing it as just something that will provide something for you, something that you can consume for
Or
whatever.
your playground.
Or a playground, yeah, whatever, or like your untouched paradise, even though it's someone else's home, right? It's not untouched. It's actually, a place where people have lived for thousands of years. So I think noticing that in myself is something that I'm hoping more people of color also notice. I want them to again be able to use travel and the outdoors as their route to self-acceptance, to self-discovery, and if our self-care or self-discovery comes at the expense of other people and other people of color mostly, which is usually what happens, then I don't think that's truly liberating, right? And I don't actually think I don't consider that self-care at all, right? So I think that's actually what we need to be thinking about. Everyone needs to be thinking out, white people, but also people of color who are trying to do these things too. How can we do this in a way that doesn't cause harm to other folks, right? And there's lots of things, like thinking of where your money goes when you travel. I think when I did that trip, I learned the term tourist leakage, which is a term that shows that even when we spend money in places that are developing, the majority of that money ends up going to white, Western, usually men, right? So a lot of times, people will travel to Latin America or to Africa or to Asia and be like, oh, at least I'm pumping money into the economy. And the reality is that's not true. Most of the money is actually going to white-owned, Western-owned, European-owned companies, buildings, resorts, all those hotels. Most of them are owned by people in the US and in Europe. So by going there and eating at the restaurants and staying in the hotels, you're actually not providing any money for the local economy at all. And in fact, sometimes it can actually even harm things by raising the prices for the locals that now can't afford it, right? We see that going on definitely in Cape Town. That's what happened with Airbnb. And I know that's happening with a lot of different industries around the world. So I think one like concrete thing folks can do is really get serious about knowing where their money's going and do that research beforehand to make sure you're telling the truth when you say, at least I'm pumping money into the local economy. Are you staying at places that are locally owned, POC owned, Black, Indigenous owned? Planning your whole trip around sustainable tourism and making sure that money is actually funneling into the places you want to support. And then, if that's impossible, which sometimes it can be under capitalism, to then think about reparations and think about what other money can you donate or contribute so that you're not just extracting from a place, but giving something back by being there. And what relationships and connections can you build there as well? And then I think, the last thing too is just making sure you research the land that you're on. I think that's something that I didn't really do until the pandemic started. I love that we started today with the land acknowledgement. I think the second step is to actually research what happened to the communities that have been here and that had stewarded the land before you got here. During the pandemic, I did this for my hometown, the place I lived 18 years. I didn't know any of the history, right? It actually had one of the highest lynching rates out of any city in the United States during the 60s. I grew up there for 18 years. I had no idea. The elementary school my friends went to was named after a white supremacist, still has that name. Didn't know that, just thought that was Grady Elementary School. And this is my hometown, right? This is the place I was born and raised. So if we put that level of intention and research also to the places we traveled to, right, I think that would give us then more of a framework and more answers to then what is the best way to contribute, right? What help needs to happen here? But I don't think we can actually do that until we really acknowledge all that's happened already, right? And what impact then we bring when we get there.
Totally. And before we jumped on this call, you were also mentioning some resources for people of color wanting to explore the outdoors. I was wondering if you could share some of these, or I don't know if Stesha has them to drop into. Do they show up in the chat for people who joined after, or okay, here they come. Let's shout some out.
Yeah, so Latino Outdoors is precious to me because when I moved here to Oakland and had only hiked with white people all my life, I found Latino Outdoors and for the first time got to do hiking trips with Latino people. Outdoor Afro is an organization here in Oakland that also sponsors hiking trips and outdoor experiences for Black folks. Queer Nature is a great organization that talks about queerness in the outdoors and how queers can relate specifically to the outdoors in a unique way. Teens of Color Abroad is an organization founded by a dear friend who studied abroad in Spain and had a transformative experience, and now gives scholarships that fully fund international language learning opportunities for only students of color all around the United States. So like, I think he cites that I think it's still like 3% or something, less than 5% of study abroad students are people of color. So we started that program in order to change those numbers. And then in terms of what I mentioned about researching the land we're on and researching the history, I'm really inspired by the Segura Te Land Trust, which is an organization here in Oakland where you can pay a land tax, where you are contributing a certain percentage of your rent towards Indigenous communities so they can then buy back the land that was stolen from them. And from what I understand in Seattle, you have Real Rent Duwamish, which is a really similar organization. So those are really great places to start as well.
Awesome. I love that. And for everybody who is watching those, Stesha has dropped links to all of those into the chat. That is okay, I love it. And this is a good transition. I would like to talk a little bit more specifically about travel. And you were just talking about, I think, teens of color abroad, and only 3 to 5% of students who study abroad being students of color. And that just reminds me, and also what you were saying earlier about how we travel with this mindset of like, what am I? Like exploring myself and going on my self-discovery journey. And not that there's anything wrong with that, honestly. Like, I think travel is powerful, both for the mind opening and healing power of travel, and also just for like seeing how other people like do life, like in a way that is not our American, but like invaluable. I think those things are super important and shouldn't be disregarded. Or for example, as a person of color, like I studied abroad in Europe, in Paris. And for me, it was wildly healing, because it was the first time, like I'm older than you, so, and there weren't as many biracial people as there are now. And I didn't grow up around any biracial people. And so to see people who just looked like me, like there were a lot of North African women, everybody thought I was North African. And just to see people who looked like me was extremely powerful. Or people like didn't give a shit that I was biracial. Like I was just like American, or just me. And so that was like a very powerful experience. So I don't want to count that aspect of it, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the privilege that comes with that, traveling abroad in that way. And you write a lot about passport privilege. Could you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, I think something else that became really clear once I started traveling was that, my parents were documented immigrants, even though we're Latinx. We came here with documentation. We had the privilege of that. I was born here, so I have the privilege of US citizenship. So I had a US passport since I was very young. And so I think I did not realize just how valuable that was, right? Until I started traveling and kind of naively telling people, oh, you should come visit me in the States, and people just kind of laughing and being like, do you have any idea what it takes for someone like me to come visit you, even for just 2 weeks?
Yeah.
I have to put money in my bank account. I have to buy the tickets beforehand without any guarantee, right, that I'll even get the visa. I need to have proof that I won't try to work there as an undocumented worker. I have to just come from a good family. There's all kinds of things, barriers that the US provides, right? For folks trying to enter. And I think as people of color, even with US passports, we don't realize that even though we have a very marginalized experience in the US, one experience of privilege we do have is having the US passport. And I think, when I was traveling, I would meet so many undocumented workers who were white, just white Europeans, white Australians who were working at a bar without documentation, overstaying their visas and being ski bums. That was just such a part of the culture of backpacking and travel. And it again made me realize, that that's also the privilege of coming from a Western country, is that people aren't really keeping an eye on you for like how you're working, how you're getting your money, how you're entering places. You can kind of bend the rules, right? The rules don't really apply to you in the same way that we think of undocumented Latinx folks and other people of color that are trying to enter the US, right? I think about that story a few years ago that Melania Trump was undocumented in the US for a while in between modeling gigs, which of course she was. It's so many people. It's very normal when you come from whiteness, when you come from privilege, to kind of be able to bend and ease the rules like that. And I saw that all the time while traveling. I saw it, given to me, right? Just people giving me the benefit of the doubt when I didn't have all my things together at the border. Remember at France, I didn't have an address of where I was actually staying, and they just kind of gave me a look and just let me go. And thinking like, I'm not sure if this wasn't a US passport that I would have gotten away with that mistake, right? So I think thinking about that and thinking about what that means as travelers, of like what our role needs to be then in immigration rights movements, and the movement, for me, I think at this point, like getting rid of borders, right? I think any traveler that has taken advantage of the privilege of a US passport should be in that movement, and contributing those experiences.
Wait, what are you talking about getting rid of borders? Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, to me, I think, if we have borders where we have different rules for different people, right? And different passports that are allowed different levels of privilege, to me, that system doesn't make sense, right? I ended my traveling knowing that I got away with as much as I did with my passport and not wanting that privilege anymore. I left thinking, I don't want borders at all. I don't want this to be conditional. It doesn't make sense. It's not fair that just because I was born in this area, I have the privilege and I have the entitlement to just plop myself in all these countries, have a backpack on, and just be able to enter these places when no one else has that same sense of entitlement or same ability to do that, right? We're taking advantage of a system that is inherently unjust. And I think travelers who aren't seeing that connection to borders and immigrant rights activism are really missing something.
Yeah, totally. And I have been just thinking about this personally. Like I have a number of Indian friends who are here in the US on work visas, but it's so they have just their status. And I also have some European friends who are here on work visas, and watching the experiences side by side is so different. Like Indian friends who've been here for they're waiting 10 years to get their green card, and their kids are going to come of age and be 18, and the kids can't stay in the US. So the family has to decide, are we going to go back to India because our child won't have American citizenship? Are we going to send the child home? Are we going to stay illegally? All of these privileges that people who are not on an American or Western European passport don't think about. So.
Yeah, and in the US, during the immigrant rights debates over these last few years, we hear so many people just saying, these people need to wait their turn. Mm-hmm. And to me, it just feels like, as a traveler with a US passport, I've never had to wait my turn, right? So it feels hypocritical to ask someone else to wait when you've never been asked to wait, right? No one ever tells you can't go on your Paris vacation, you have to wait your turn, right? Like that doesn't happen to Americans.
Well, you called out recently that people, I don't remember where it was, maybe it was your Instagram or piece of writing, that Americans are indignant that there was during the pandemic, Europeans were like, no, thank you. And Americans right. just lost their minds because did you not understand? I'm American. Did you hear me? American.
Yeah, that was the first time we got a dose of our own medicine, right?
Yes.
And it was interesting. It's where you saw that entitlement come out that no one did, when folks are saying, oh, they need to wait their turn or whatever. I just want to play by the rules. We don't notice that sense of entitlement until it kind of backfires and it's put on us, right? Until other folks have now the power to say, you can't come to our country. I saw the same thing when I traveled, and Bolivia at the time decided to charge Americans the visa fee that we charge them. Mm-hmm. So many people from the US were living at that, right? We have to pay $150 to enter Bolivia. Mm-hmm. But I think they called it the reciprocity tax, or some people were calling it that as a way to say, you can't keep doing this to other people and then not expecting us to do the same to you.
Yes, such a good call out. So good for people to remember. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or advice or resources for traveling as a person of color, for traveling safely and feeling like you belong.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer because I don't want to, I feel the same way as traveling as a woman. I feel like so many of the narratives we hear from women and people of color who do this try to paint it as this idyllic experience. And we do it in order to convince folks not to be afraid, right? And to be brave. And there's always a narrative of bravery. And I agree with that to some extent, but I also don't want to delegitimize or diminish that the danger is real, right? And those things can happen, and they have happened to me and to many other women and people of color that have taken the risks that I have. So it's this hard balance of knowing how not to delegitimize or diminish that real pain and real danger, and also hope that doesn't discourage folks from doing it anyways. And so I think in terms of tips, I know as a person of color now, I have a really high standard for who I travel with, especially on a very remote location. So especially if I'm traveling with white folks, I want to make sure that they're the kind of person that will have my back, right? Not the kind of person that if we see a Confederate flag and I want to turn around, they'll just kind of eye roll and be like, you're exaggerating, you don't want that kind of situation. You want to have a partner in travel that is going to be able to maybe not experience spaces in the same way you do, but will trust you when you're experiencing a space in a different way and need to like create a different boundary or need to leave, right? I also want that person to like know that we have a system in place for when that happens, right? A lot of the friends of color, my partner of color from last year, we used to have like a word we would say if a space just started to feel unsafe.
Mm.
And that word was said, then we knew like, okay, I'm not gonna ask questions now, we're just gonna get in the car and then decide what happens. We would also make very strategic decisions. Whenever we were out there, if we forgot something and I had to go inside a gas station, I would go because traveling with a Black man, I felt like privilege and a lot more safety that I should go into the market, and that would make things easier and safer for everyone. So I think traveling with folks that can acknowledge that and can have those conversations of who has the most privilege here, who should be in charge of what based on that privilege, how can they yield that privilege to keep all of us safe, how can they trust me when I tell them I'm not unsafe. I think that's the best you can do in terms of keeping yourself in the best place possible as you're doing this stuff.
Yeah, those are really good tips that I hadn't thought of before. And I really appreciate you just calling out some of those specific examples, because I think that people who are not from marginalized spaces don't understand like what it's like to go into a gas station in a remote area, whether in another country. I just feel uncomfortable going to small towns in Eastern Washington, for example. And that's something that white people, I think it doesn't cross their mind for half a second. So I really appreciate you calling out some of these ways so that white people who are traveling with people of color can try to be a little bit more aware, a little bit more sensitive of these situations.
Right. And they show up in lots of different ways, right? If you're traveling, like, how are you going to deal with Border Patrol? What's going to, people are going to have different experiences at that border, right? When I traveled with kids of color, all the white kids got through at the border, all the kids of color got questioned, got searched, had to go into that room. So you have to be prepared for those situations, right? And in the outdoors, there's park rangers, there's police, right? There are people, maybe you're with a crew of folks that want to break all the rules because they're not scared that the police might show up and, they can kind of figure it out. But yeah, those conversations need to happen, right? Because if you're in the middle of nowhere and you're breaking all the rules at the campsite and the police show up, people are going to have very different reactions, right? So I think being able to have those conversations with the people you travel with is really important.
So important. And like internationally, but even domestically, like when I come home from Seattle, from Europe, if I'm not with my white husband, I'm stopped and my bags are always. And the only two things that keep me from getting stopped is if I'm with my white husband or if I dig out my Yale baseball cap that I have just for travel, I'm not stopped. And it's so patently obvious, that like it makes me laugh and want to cry at the same time.
My brown hoodie on the plane.
Okay, and Stasha dropped in the chat. Please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A at any time. If anybody has questions, please do that because we're wrapping up. Let's see, we have so many good things here to talk about. I think that we've been over like a lot of what I wanted to talk about. And I would just like to ask if you could talk a little bit about where people can find you and your amazing work. And then also if you're working on anything upcoming that you're excited about or future plans or what direction your work is going.
Yeah, well, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Amanda E. Machado 0. You can find all my writing and all my speaking engagements, all of that on my website, amandaemachado.com. And also, I think Stasha dropped in the chat, I write a blog newsletter occasionally, not as consistently as I'd like, but occasionally, that is all about just like random musings on race, gender, sexuality, and travel in the outdoors. So you can also subscribe.
I was gonna say, people can subscribe to that, right? Okay, cool.
You can read it online or you can subscribe and then it'll just get delivered into your inbox whenever I've published a new one.
Yes, I love it. And what is the future of your work looking like? Has it been impacted by the pandemic? What are your thoughts on like hopefully we will be post pandemic at some point in time, but like, or even this kind of interim stage, like how are you feeling about travel right now?
Yeah, I think mixed. I think the pandemic honestly made me, as I've kind of spoken about already, just really kind of reframe and really reflect on how the way I was traveling before was too much, was kind of an addiction to novelty to some extent, was reproducing a lot of colonialist systems of just like taking and showing up and leaving. And, just realizing, I read Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. She has this wonderful quote about settlers being people who live without 2 feet on the shore. 1 foot is always on the boat. They never feel like they're staying or going. They don't know. And I felt like deeply read by that statement. Felt like that was, that's who I've been. I've been someone who's been incredibly rootless through my travel lifestyle. And it never occurred to me to think about that as something that's anti-Indigenous. And so I think what I'm realizing now is, like, how can we be people who love travel and exploring, but not reproduce these colonial ideas, right? Not build an identity out of rootlessness, when I think right now what we need a lot of is returning back to indigeneity and Indigenous practices. So I think that's actually what I'm thinking about now, is like, how can I reframe and unlearn a lot of the ways that I've been told to think about travel in the outdoors, to make it more about connection and relationship, rather than like bucket lists and constant movement. I know that there's this activist writer, Kim Tallbear, who says that nature for her, she always says that people will translate words as like, oh, this is like a sacred site for Indigenous people, and that she actually thinks that translation is wrong, because the word she would use is more, it's not that it's sacred, it's that it's a relative, that this area of nature is not like a temple, it's just a relative, it's someone we have a relationship with. And I think about that a lot now whenever I'm outside. That was never the way I was taught to be outside when I was hiking and exploring. And so I think the direction I want to take my work and my writing and my thinking is thinking more about that, like, what would the outdoors look like if we were seeing nature as a relative and not as this pristine, sacred place that we escape to, right? And how would that reframe our relationship to it?
Oh, that's like giving me goosebumps, like such a good vision. I can't wait to see, like, I can't wait to keep up on your writing about that. And I heard a podcast you did recently about nomad culture. And like, it's like, I think largely, well, or at least in part due to social media, this culture of just like travel around, live here for a month, 2 months here, like go all over the world. And I think that this message that you're bringing is a really important counterbalance to that. Like all that, a big part of that nomad culture is what you described as having like one foot on the shore and one foot on the boat, right? Like ready to take off. So people can maybe think about, I love this, like as food for thought for people who are really excited to get back to traveling post-pandemic, or who want to explore that kind of more nomadic lifestyle. So I'm excited to see what you write about.
Thank you.
And we have a couple questions here. So I saw somebody asked if this chat was going to be recorded, and it is. It will be posted on the Seattle Public Library's YouTube channel, I believe YouTube. Stasha, correct me if I have that wrong. So just so everybody knows that. And then Karina asks, can you talk about how light brown skinned Latinas can use our privilege to center Black and Indigenous communities while traveling in the US and abroad?
Oof, such a good question. Yeah, I think this last year really brought this to the forefront, finally, way late than it should have been. I think I facilitate a lot of Latinx affinity spaces. I'm in a lot of POC spaces. And I think, I think anti-Blackness in Latinx communities is such a real thing. Anyone who's grown up in a Latinx family knows this, knows that it's existing in our own family, knows that it's tolerated in culture. I think when Roma came out, we saw a lot of this being put out in public with the way Yalitza was treated. I think we see this with Pose and the way most Latinx people don't see Pose as a Latinx show, even though the main actors in that show are Black Latinx trans women. So I think it's just a conversation that needs to constantly be happening. I think for me, it's acknowledging that when I'm with Black folks and traveling, as I said in that story earlier, like being the first to say that, not making it the responsibility of someone else to call that out, but naming that yourself. Like, I have privilege in this situation. What can I do? How can I take advantage of it? How can I make everyone else safer? And then I think it's also, again, just the research question of like really understanding and unpacking how deep anti-Blackness goes in Latinx culture, and really being able to know that history. So many parts of Latinx culture come from Black people, and they're never cited. It's never attributed to Black culture, right? Salsa invented by Black people. We never think about it that way. Cumbia in Mexico, I was never told, was invented by Black folks. Agua de Jamaica is like famous in Mexico, came from Africa. Enslaved people came here and created that, right? We see it as a Mexican drink. My mom called it a Mexican drink, but there's no acknowledgement of how that Mexican cultural piece actually comes from a really deep and dark history with the slave trade. So I think reconnecting to that and unlearning things and learning more about how Black history is so entangled in Latinx culture, and calling that out whenever you see it so it can't be erased, is an important first step. I don't have any like other answers at this point other than just to keep sitting with it. You know, I think as POCs, it's much easier to think about our marginalization than to think about the ways we still have privilege. And so I think, you know, as a cis person, as a light-skinned Latinx person, I'm trying to spend more of my time not centering whiteness and the way whiteness marginalizes me, but instead thinking about the ways that I'm also, you know, in a position of privilege and needing to unpack that as well.
Love it. Such a good answer. So good. Such a good question. Thank you, Karina. Okay, I think we don't have any more questions, and I want to be respectful of time. It's already past 7. So before Stasha jumps back on here, I just want to say thank you so much for talking with me. This talk. I'm sorry. Okay. Do you have time for one more quick question?
Go for it.
Okay. Jaylene asks how to reintroduce outdoors to family/folks, specifically when they relate camping and being out in the wild as going back to poverty.
Oof, yeah, that's a hard question. I guess first be patient. I think it takes time. And again, that trauma is really real. I know my parents said that when I first started camping, like we worked all our lives to put a roof on your head, and now you want to go sleep outside with no roof on your head. So that goes really deeply, and it's very real. I think when my parents saw how much joy it gave me, and when I invited them on trips that were smaller, like flatter trails, but still in the woods, then they started to realize, like similar to my coworker, right, that hiking is just walking. And if it's a little bit more difficult, or if you're wearing certain gear, then we call it hiking. But really, this is something we've always done. And then I think, you know, in those moments is usually when those memories come out, right? Once you're going on like an easy walk through the woods, then folks start to mention, oh, you know, like I used to walk in my grandparents' house, or we used to have an orange tree, just like this one on this corner, you know, like, or, oh, my mom used to use this plant actually to make this tea. So I think the more we just get people outside in more accessible ways, those memories start to come up that are positive and that are intergenerational, right? Things that have been passed down for years that might have just been pushed down because we've been told that we have to hustle in the city in order to get ahead, and that all the stuff that we know about connecting to nature is not what's going to get us ahead, especially here in the United States. I think we can tap back into that once we start taking it slow, right, and being really patient with folks. I know when my dad came to visit me in Cape Town with my mom, my dad actually wanted to hike to the top of Table Mountain. My dad was in his 70s. I was really nervous because that is not an easy hike. It's 1,000 meters straight up. He was panting the entire time, but made it. And I remember when we were at the top of it, he finally did say, you know, like, it is kind of crazy, right? Like, I'm from the Andes. Like, why did I never do this? And it was just a really beautiful moment of being like, okay, like he looks like he's struggling, but he's having a good time, and he's getting it, you know. But it takes a long time, and it, you know, I think you just have to be patient and trust that it'll happen.
Yes, love that image of like your dad like making it up to the top, and like you guys having that moment together. Good, another really good question. Thank you for asking. Okay, so but I want to be respectful of your time and of everybody else's time. So I just want to say thank you so much for speaking with me. Just in reading your work and having this conversation, it's really like expanded my mind. It's made me think more about how I want to be in nature. It's made me think more, especially more about how I want to travel. So thank you so much. I've really loved it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun. Thanks so much.
Of course. And we'll turn it back over to Stasha.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful conversation. And I agree with you, Alaya, that I'm going to definitely think differently about how I travel in the future. Definitely go to Amanda's website and read some of her articles about that as well. So thank you so much. There are 2 more amazing events scheduled in this series. The next event is on Monday, November 15th, and features Caroline Dooner. She and Alaya will talk about the harm of diet culture and what you can do to fight that. The book that she's going to be talking about is called The Fuck It Diet. I read it last fall at Olaya's recommendation, and it's wonderful. So highly recommend. And you can find more information about Olaya's entire series at the link that I just popped in the chat. And As I mentioned, we're interested in hearing from you. I'm going to post a link to a program survey in the chat as we're closing tonight. And I'd really appreciate it if you took a minute after the event to fill it out. We'd love to hear what you think. I'm so grateful to everybody who made today's program possible. Thank you to our program partners, Third Place Books, and thanks to our sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Times, and the Seattle Public Library Foundation. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Thanks so much for being here, and we will see you next time. Good night.
Bye.